The records were found in a cedar chest beneath the collapsed flooring of a house that no longer exists. The handwriting belonged to one man, yet the voices within it seemed to multiply with every page. By the time the final entry ended, entire generations had vanished into silence. Welcome back. Before we continue, like, subscribe, share. The story begins in St. Martha Parish, Louisiana, 1860, at the threshold of a nation splitting in two. Cotton prices were soaring, the war had not yet begun, and the boundary between commerce and conscience had grown perilously thin. Among the planters who prospered during this uneasy calm was Silas Branford, proprietor of Elysian Field Plantation, a property that stretched from the Bayou to the black swamps of Iberia. Local papers described him as industrious, modern-minded, a gentleman of sound Christian habits. Those who lived under his roof knew another truth. The earliest surviving account comes from Dr. Edwin Lockett, a parish physician whose ledgers record frequent visits to Elysian Field in the months preceding the war. His notes mention domestic confinements, recurring fever among the housemaids, and the master's insistence on privacy during all examinations. The phrasing is cold, professional, and yet behind each line lingers something unsaid. No patient names are given, only initials repeated through the pages, A, C, and F, with annotations concerning exhaustion, fainting, and hysteria of moral origin. By 1861, neighbors had begun whispering about the Branford daughters. 3 young women, Abigail, Clara, and Fay, rarely appeared beyond the veranda. The family claimed delicate health, the parish gossiped of scandal. There were rumors of a private infirmary established in one of the carriage houses, and of nocturnal deliveries performed by Dr. Lockett without registration at the courthouse. None of these suspicions reached official record. The South had perfected the art of silence. The Branford journals, discovered in 1919 by surveyors draining the Bayou, begin with meticulous plantation accounts. Bushels, wages, shipments, and gradually darken into something else. The writing grows cramped, impatient, almost feverish. The tone shifts from commerce to doctrine, as if the author were attempting to justify an experiment he no longer controlled. Blood is inheritance. One entry reads, "If commerce is to be sustained through the coming chaos, the source of supply must be internal." What that sentence means has been debated by historians for a century. Some interpret it as simple agricultural metaphor, others as something far more intimate and horrifying. The remainder of the ledger suggests that Branford sought to breed loyalty within his own property. His word, not mine, by merging the categories of family and labor until they were indistinguishable. In a letter dated May 1860, addressed to a colleague in Natchez, he wrote, "The experiment proceeds favorably, though the women grow fearful. They must learn that nature obeys purpose, not sentiment. Posterity will understand what necessity compelled." That letter was never sent. It was found folded inside the same book that contained the plantation's birth records, all unsigned, each line ending with a number rather than a name, even at the remove of a century and a half. The documents radiate an air of deliberate erasure. The overseer's log for that year lists no shipments for 4 consecutive months. The parish census omits the Branford daughters entirely, as if they had ceased to exist. Yet a merchant in Baton Rouge noted several transactions from Silas Branford involving infant provisions and traveling expenses during the same period. The trail is faint but undeniable. A modern historian might call this a case study in domestic authoritarianism. Contemporary witnesses called it the Branford misfortune. What began as ambition hardened into obsession, and what was justified as improvement descended into ritual. Elysian Field became, by slow degrees, a laboratory of hierarchy disguised as home. Lockett's later testimony, recorded in 1874 when he was an old man seeking absolution, contains a single paragraph about the master's state of mind, mystery. Branford had come to regard his household not as a family, but as an economy. He spoke of offspring in the same terms one uses for stock. and a virtue as a hindrance to continuity. I observed in him the mania of the statistician. He could measure suffering, but not feel it. There is no need to embellish. The horror lies in the arithmetic. By the time Union troops entered the parish in 1863, the Branford name had already become synonymous with ruin. What happened inside those walls remains fragmentary, reconstructed from court petitions, physicians' notes, and oral recollections, whispered long after the war. Yet each source agrees on one detail. The women of the household were seen only at night, their faces veiled, their voices low, as if conditioned to silence. When the chest containing these records was opened in 1919, the air inside was described as smelling of iron and salt. Alongside the papers lay a single child's bracelet engraved with the initials E.B. No such name appears in parish baptism rolls. The item now rests in a locked cabinet at Louisiana State University, labeled simply Provenance Unverified. For decades, scholars debated whether the Branford journals were genuine or apocryphal. Handwriting analysis confirmed their authenticity in 1987. Yet questions persist about how many of the entries were written by Silas himself, and how many by others within the household. Certain pages display a hesitant, almost trembling script, as though dictated under duress. Linguists note abrupt changes in grammar, suggesting more than one hand contributing to the same confession. It is this confusion, between author and victim, between scientist and subject, that gives the Branford papers their dreadful vitality. They are less a record of events than an anatomy of control, how a man convinced himself that necessity excused everything, and how a community convinced itself not to see. The tragedy of Elysian Field cannot be separated from the larger sickness of its era. The plantation system, already dependent on bondage, encouraged a mentality in which ownership extended to bloodlines themselves. In that moral vacuum, a mind like Branford's could flourish, shielded by law, status, and silence. His journals are not confessions, they are calculations. The lineage must remain pure enough to trade, yet pliant enough to serve. He wrote near the end of 1861, "All elements of sentiment are to be suppressed." After that line, the handwriting stops abruptly. A later entry, different ink, uncertain hand, simply reads, "Mother watches at the window." He says the sky is an open wound. Whether that sentence was written by Abigail, Clara, or Fay, no one can say. But from that moment onward, the plantation ledger becomes a chronicle of decline, erratic cotton yields, unexplained deaths among the servants, and payments to Dr. Lockett growing larger with every visit. By December 1861, the journal descends into lists without context, quantities of Lennon, laudanum again, and something noted as herb mixture for regulation. It is impossible to know what that meant, but the implication is chilling. The final pages are water, stained, possibly by flood or by deliberate washing. In the last legible entry, the writer quotes scripture, "The sins of the fathers shall be visited upon the children." Beneath it, faintly penciled, another hand adds, "We are the children." That is where part one of this investigation ends. With a ledger that tried to balance human souls against the price of cotton, and a family name that history nearly erased, the parish archives of St. Landry contain many volumes from 1860–1863, but none quite as curious as the Branford estate ledgers. They were first catalogued in 1911, long after the plantation itself had fallen into ruin. The paper was brittle, the ink unevenly preserved, and yet each page felt warm to the touch, as though it had absorbed the breath of those who once wrote upon it. The handwriting alternated between two distinct hands, one firm and mechanical, the other light and tremulous. The former belonged to Silas Branford, the plantation's owner. The latter, by all stylistic comparisons, to Henrietta, his wife. Historians disagree about whether she wrote willingly or under coercion, but there is an undeniable pattern. Every entry in her hand begins after midnight. The candle smoke stains on the upper margins confirm it. The early entries are practical, lists of seed stock, cloth, medicine, and the precise tally of those in residence on the estate. But by the spring of 1861, the tone shifts. There are lines struck out, entire paragraphs erased in thick ink strokes. Only occasional fragments remain. Ducre. Calloway insists the measurements are irregular. And later, the cries have drawn attention. No one can say with certainty what those phrases referred to, but they coincide with parish reports of unnatural experiments being conducted in isolated rural properties along the Cane River corridor. At the time, Louisiana was fracturing under the weight of secession, and official oversight was nearly absent. It was a season that permitted secrecy. The Branford estate, known as Elysian Field, stood apart not only for its acreage, but for its peculiar reputation. The surrounding community whispered that the house itself grew sick. Visitors remarked on a faint odor of iron and vinegar in its corridors, and on the silence of those who lived within its walls. Even the enslaved workers, ordinarily so vocal in song or prayer, moved quietly, like people walking in a church after burial. In the summer of 1861, Dr. Ephraim Calloway, a physician from Baton Rouge with interests in hereditary conditions, began visiting twice monthly. Surviving correspondence between him and Branford suggests they were engaged in what Calloway termed a domestic inquiry into degenerative inheritance. He claimed to be studying the visible signs of ancestral fatigue, a pseudoscientific notion that the burdens of sin could express themselves through the body. Among Calloway's preserved papers is one short report dated August 14, 1861. The younger subject's present features of alarming similarity. In the elder daughter, the eyes, gray as the father's, reflect a premature awareness inconsistent with her years. The younger is of slighter constitution, though her pulse betrays remarkable vigor. Both seem to manifest that peculiar mixture of docility and resistance characteristic of the Branford line. The language, clinical yet unsettling, reveals much about the mindset of the men involved. Their curiosity was not compassionate, it was diagnostic. They treated suffering as specimen, tragedy as data. By autumn, the plantation's rhythms had altered completely. The bells marking work hours ceased ringing. Deliveries arrived only at night. Dr. Calloway moved his lodgings into a detached carriage house, which he modified into what one witness described as a place of study, smelling of ether. The lone first-hand account from within those walls comes from a letter written decades later by Isaac Turner, a freedman who once tended the Branford stables. He recalled seeing glass jars with something pale inside them, and hearing soft voices reading numbers aloud. When questioned about what else he witnessed, Turner said only, "Some things the Lord don't mean for us to tell twice." The more one examines the historical record, the more one senses the convergence of faith and horror in this household. Parish records note that Reverend Hollis of St. Matthew's Chapel refused communion to Silas Branford in early 1862, citing unconfessed offenses against the natural order. That same year, Henrietta ceased attending services altogether. The Reverend's diary, discovered in the 1980s, contains a haunting line. They pursue a kind of salvation that no altar can bless. The community, meanwhile, observed peculiar nocturnal lights along the riverbank. Farmers reported seeing figures carrying lanterns into the cypress groves, where the Branford family maintained small burial plots. When approached, these figures would extinguish their lamps and vanish into the mist. It was during this period that the Branford daughters, Agnes and Lucille, virtually disappeared from public sight. School attendance records from St. Mary's Convent show their last appearance in November 1861. Their names never reappear, not in censuses, church confirmations, nor marriage rolls. It is as though their lives became confined to the house itself, absorbed by it, or erased within its walls. Several later testimonies from neighboring estates mention the occasional sighting of two pale girls walking near the property's northern orchard, sometimes barefoot, sometimes carrying what looked like ledgers or bound papers. The accounts are vague, often written decades after the fact, but consistent in tone. The witnesses felt pity and unease rather than fear. When the war drew closer to Louisiana in 1863, Elysian Field became increasingly isolated. Silas refused to send men to the Confederate cause, citing private obligations of higher purpose. In his own surviving notes, he wrote that the bloodline experiment nears conclusion. Scholars still debate what he meant. Some think he was referring to the literal continuation of his family line under siege. Others suspect a more obsessive form of research. In January 1863, Henrietta's handwriting reappears briefly in the ledger. Her final entry reads, "He says the body is only a vessel, and that our task is to refine it, to remove the corruption that began with the first sin." I no longer know whether he speaks of himself or of God. After that, the ledgers fall silent for nearly 6 months. When the pages resume in the summer of 1863, the handwriting is neither Silas's nor Henrietta's. It is an unfamiliar, unsteady script. Only one line appears across a page otherwise blank. The field is quiet now. He is beneath it. No one knows who wrote it. Modern historians often treat the Branford records as allegory, a grim parable of obsession, isolation, and the corrosive power of unchecked authority. Yet the physical evidence, the ledgers, Dr. Calloway's notes, the Reverend's diary, and the oral accounts, suggest that something literal, not metaphorical, transpired within that house. Even the soil seems to remember. When archaeologists conducted limited excavations on the site in 1984, they discovered beneath what would have been the southern veranda a patch of ground, unusually rich in calcium and char. Human remains. None confirmed, but chemical analysis detected traces of lime and ash consistent with hasty interments. Locals still avoid the place. The road leading there, now little more than a rutted lane, is sometimes called the Doctor's Path. Older residents of Stain, Landry Parish tell their children not to linger near it after sundown. It remembers names. They say, it repeats them. The true story may never be known in full, because truth itself was the first casualty inside Elysian Field. What remains are fragments, ledgers without context, letters without replies, and the uneasy feeling that the line between research and ritual was crossed quietly, irreversibly. The summer of 1863 was unusually humid along the Mississippi, the air thick with the smell of river mud and wildflowers. The Branford estate seemed to sweat with the season, the cypress groves curling their dark, heavy limbs over the main house, as if to hide it from the world. Within its walls, however, an entirely different storm had begun to stir, one not of weather, but of conscience. Henrietta Branford, long subdued under the weight of Silas's authority, had begun to take note of subtle changes among the enslaved men and women on the estate. They moved differently, spoke in coded whispers, and sometimes left small tokens in hidden corners, tales of defiance that no overseer could read. Tobias, a tall, wiry man who had once worked the stables, had become a quiet anchor for this invisible network. His loyalty to the Branford daughters, Agnes and Lucille, was unmatched, born of both a protective instinct and a deep understanding of the atrocities that had been committed within the house. The awakening of resistance was slow. Small acts, seemingly insignificant, were the first signs: doors left unlatched, keys misplaced. A note slipped into Henrietta's hand stating simply, "They watch. But we watch too." These small interventions were meticulously calculated. One wrong move could mean death. Henrietta's role, however, was far more dangerous than that of the others. Her position as Silas's wife granted her access to areas and information denied to anyone else. She quietly documented everything: nightly observations, Silas's schedule, and, most crucially, the physical and emotional states of her daughters. She recorded how Agnes moved, how her eyes would sometimes fill with tears at night, or how Lucille would speak to shadows in her room. Each note was coded, often mixing dates, herbs, and tasks in seemingly banal entries, her way of evading discovery while preserving evidence. By mid-July 1863, Henrietta had become the hub of a clandestine network. Tobias recruited 3 other enslaved men who had been forced to witness and participate in Silas's abuses. Each carried their own story of trauma. One had been compelled to move the daughters between rooms during study sessions. Another had been threatened with severe punishment for refusing to obey, and the third had secretly tended to a newborn taken from Agnes after a miscarriage. They were bound together by a shared desire for justice, a quiet storm brewing in secrecy. Silas, increasingly obsessed with the success of his so-called experiments, began to let his guard down. His nightly excursions to play cards at a local tavern became predictable. He would return late, often drunk, and his steps faltering along the dirt trail leading back to the estate. He assumed his wealth, and social respectability protected him, that no one would dare cross the authority of a man like him. But resistance does not wait for permission. Henrietta and Tobias watched, measured, and planned. Every detail was accounted for: the path Silas would take, the location of hidden weapons, the timing of moonlight and storm clouds to obscure their approach. They knew that confrontation inside the house would be suicide. The only chance to end the reign of terror was to intercept him before he crossed the threshold of the estate. The night finally arrived in July 1863. A violent thunderstorm had swept across the delta, lightning flickering through the low, hanging clouds. Henrietta and Tobias, along with the 3 men recruited for the task, positioned themselves along the overgrown trail that led to the main house. Their breaths formed small clouds in the humid air as they waited, silent except for the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. When Silas appeared, staggering on his horse, oblivious to the storm, the plan went into motion. Tobias moved first, lunging from the shadows to knock him from the horse. Henrietta held the reins, steadying the animal, while the others surrounded Silas, ensuring he could neither flee nor call for help. It was executed with grim efficiency, a measured act of desperation by those who had endured years of unimaginable suffering. Silas did not understand the threat until it was too late. He cried out, a sound of both fear and disbelief, but no one came to his aid. The storm, the trees, and the darkness swallowed his voice. In minutes, his body lay still. Henrietta and Tobias worked quickly to stage the scene. They scattered personal belongings along the trail, including a lantern and a wallet, and inflicted minor wounds on the horse to suggest a struggle. When the body was discovered the next morning by a passing farmer, the official narrative took hold. Silas Branford had fallen victim to wandering bandits, a plausible explanation amid the chaos of the Civil War and increasing lawlessness in the region. Sheriff Langley investigated, but offered only a perfunctory assessment, writing in his report that banditry is rampant. The circumstances seem consistent. No one suspected the careful orchestration of the Branford women and their allies. The aftermath was immediate and profound. Within the first week, Henrietta freed all enslaved workers on the estate. Tobias and the others disappeared into the delta, likely traveling north or blending into the region's small free black communities. The plantation, once a hub of cruelty and exploitation, was now a locus of cautious freedom. But freedom did not erase trauma. Agnes gave birth to her 3rd child in August 1863. Still physically weakened and emotionally fragile from years of forced pregnancies, Lucille remained reclusive, haunted by memories that surfaced in dreams and involuntary flashes during the day. Henrietta dedicated herself to caring for her daughters, attempting to repair both body and mind. Yet she carried a profound guilt for what had transpired under her roof, and for the daughter she had failed to save years earlier, whose absence weighed on every quiet moment. The physical structures of Elysian Field remained, but the life they had known was gone. The main house, the stables, and the carriage house stood as mute witnesses to horrors long past. Archaeologists and historians later noted that the estate's soil contained remnants of hastily buried items, perhaps tools, perhaps personal effects, undisturbed for decades. Even in ruin, the land seemed to resist forgetting. The story of Branford Estate is not only a tale of cruelty, but also one of courage and moral reckoning. Henrietta's clandestine documentation preserved a record of atrocities that might otherwise have been lost to history. Tobias and the other enslaved men risked everything to act against a system designed to render them powerless. And yet, the tragedy endures. The psychological and physical scars on Agnes and Lucille never fully healed. They lived long after the events, but with lives constrained by trauma, a constant reminder of the depths of human cruelty and the resilience required to survive it. Historians note that the Branford narrative exemplifies a broader pattern in antebellum Louisiana and the South. The legal system, social structures, and entrenched patriarchy created conditions in which private horrors could flourish, hidden in plain sight. Officials like Sheriff Langley and neighbors accepted convenient explanations rather than probe deeper, highlighting societal indifference to abuse, particularly when perpetrated by socially respected men. Henrietta's final years were spent quietly, tending to her daughters and preserving the ledgers. Her meticulous notes became the foundation for later research into family exploitation, abuse of authority, and the intersection of slavery with domestic tyranny. She wrote in her journal, "Justice sometimes sleeps while the innocent suffer, but the memory of what was done cannot be buried entirely. One day, someone must bear witness." The Branford estate itself was eventually sold and subdivided, its structures gradually falling into ruin. By the 1870s, the main house had collapsed, leaving only the cypress groves and overgrown fields. Locals avoided the property, sensing a lingering presence of sorrow and injustice. Even today, passing through the area, one can feel the weight of what occurred. A silence that speaks louder than words, a warning etched into the delta soil. In reflecting on these events, historians and ethicists alike consider the Branford case a dark mirror. It exposes the fragility of moral oversight when combined with unchecked authority and societal indifference. It illustrates how ordinary men and women, placed in positions of power without accountability, can rationalize acts of extreme cruelty. Yet, it also illuminates the possibilities of resistance and the courage of those who act, even when all systems fail to protect the vulnerable. The tale of Elysian Field reminds us that vigilance is not merely legal, but moral, that justice may require extraordinary acts, and that the echoes of oppression can linger for generations. The descendants of those involved carry the legacy, both of suffering and survival, a testament to the enduring human capacity for both horror and heroism. The land, the ledgers, and the memories of the survivors remain as silent witnesses. They ask only that history not forget the lessons buried there, that human dignity can be stripped by authority, that conscience can awaken even after years of repression, and that the fight for justice, though delayed, can never be entirely extinguished. Even as the fields have returned to cultivation, the story of Branford Estate remains, a cautionary tale of absolute power, absolute cruelty, and the courage required to reclaim what humanity remains. The year 1864 brought a tentative calm to the Mississippi Delta, but the shadows of the Branford Estate's horrors lingered, heavy as the humid air that clung to the cypress trees. The Civil War raged elsewhere, consuming cities and towns. Yet in the rural stretches, where the Branford Plantation once operated, life had changed irrevocably. What remained was not only the land itself, but also the memories etched into those who had survived. Henrietta Branford became the reluctant guardian of history. The estate, though freed from Silas's tyrannical grip, remained a place of pain. Each room, hallway, and staircase recalled acts of cruelty, the harsh punishments, the forced pregnancies, the stolen children. She worked tirelessly to restore what she could, both physically, by repairing the main house, and emotionally, by attending to her daughters, Agnes and Lucille. Yet she understood that the deepest wounds were invisible, embedded in memory and psyche. Agnes, now a young woman of 18, struggled to reclaim her life. Her body had endured more than it was meant to bear. Her mind haunted by relentless trauma, she clung fiercely to the child she had been allowed to keep, a fragile link to hope in a world that had offered her none. Lucille, meanwhile, remained withdrawn, often speaking to no one but shadows. Each night, she replayed the horrors of her forced participation in the breeding schemes and the loss of siblings and peers. Though free, the chains of memory bound them as tightly as the physical chains they had once worn. The freed slaves faced their own complex realities. Tobias had left the Delta, likely seeking refuge in New Orleans or further north, where the chaos of war offered the possibility of reinvention. Though he escaped physical bondage, the psychological scars of enforced complicity remained. He carried the memory of every night he had stood guard, every time he had obeyed orders that violated his conscience, and every act he had witnessed without the ability to intervene. His freedom was bittersweet, a constant reminder of the lives destroyed around him. Leah, too, left the plantation shortly after liberation. She settled in New Orleans, working as a seamstress and attempting to build a new life. Yet her experiences at Branford Estate left indelible marks. Her hands bore calluses from labor, and her heart carried the weight of a grief that had no outlet. She never spoke of the estate, keeping the horrors locked in silence. But the emotional and physical scars remained, a living testament to the abuse she had endured. Henrietta's efforts to care for her daughters were complicated by their lingering distrust of authority and men. Agnes developed an almost pathological need to control her environment, fearful of any situation that might echo past abuses. Lucille retreated further into herself, becoming an observer of life rather than a participant. Henrietta, in turn, struggled with guilt, replaying her own inaction before Silas's death. She wondered constantly if she could have saved Frida, the youngest daughter, whose death had finally catalyzed the action that ended Silas's reign. The answer haunted her until her own final days. Meanwhile, the wider world moved on, largely oblivious to the dark history of the Branford estate. Official records noted only that Silas Branford had been killed by bandits, and that Frida had died of melancholy. These sanitized versions of events obscured the profound abuses that had occurred, hiding the suffering of women and enslaved people from public scrutiny. The legal and social structures of the time were ill-equipped, or unwilling, to confront domestic and sexual abuse, especially when perpetrated by men of status. It would take decades before historians, digging through private ledgers, letters, and oral histories, could reconstruct what had occurred. Henrietta's secret journals, carefully hidden and later discovered by her descendants, provided a crucial record. They chronicled the meticulous cruelty of Silas Branford, the calculated enforcement of the breeding program, and the strategies of resistance orchestrated by those he had sought to dominate. These documents became foundational in understanding how systems of power could be manipulated to abuse not only enslaved people, but also one's own family, extending the horrors of slavery into private life in unprecedented ways. In examining the Branford case, scholars noted several disturbing patterns. First, the legal system's failure allowed Silas's abuses to persist unchecked. Sheriff Langley's superficial investigation of Frida's death exemplified the institutionalized indifference to private violence, particularly against women and enslaved people. Second, the social structures of patriarchy and wealth insulated Silas, giving him the freedom to rationalize acts of extreme cruelty. Third, the complicity of those around him, whether out of fear, self-interest, or social conditioning, enabled abuses that might otherwise have been challenged. Yet within this darkness, the courage and resilience of the oppressed emerge as remarkable. Henrietta's careful documentation, the collective planning of Tobias and other enslaved men, and the eventual intervention that ended Silas's tyranny highlight how resistance can thrive, even in the most constrained circumstances. Their actions represent a form of moral reckoning, a reclaiming of agency in a system designed to strip it away. The psychological impact on survivors was profound and long-lasting. Agnes and Lucille carried their trauma into adulthood, affecting relationships, self-perception, and mental health. Agnes's attachment to her surviving child was both a source of comfort and a reflection of her inability to let go of the past. Lucille's withdrawal illustrated the deep-seated effects of prolonged psychological oppression and the ways in which victims internalize trauma. For Henrietta, the constant reminder of her family's suffering shaped every choice she made, driving her to protect, preserve, and bear witness to the past. The physical remnants of Branford Estate also became a symbol of the past. The main house, demolished in the 1870s, left only a few foundations and overgrown fields. The land itself seemed to carry the memory of suffering, a reminder that the scars of human cruelty are not always visible, but persist in subtle, enduring ways. Farmers who later cultivated the land often remarked on its strange stillness, the sensation that it had seen too much to rest. In modern historical discourse, Branford Estate serves as a cautionary tale. It demonstrates how absolute power, when combined with social approval and legal immunity, can lead to systematic abuses that extend even to one's family. It also underscores the necessity of moral courage, illustrating how individuals like Henrietta and Tobias can intervene, even at great personal risk, to protect the vulnerable and dismantle systems of abuse. The legacy of Branford Estate also informs contemporary conversations about trauma, resilience, and justice. Survivors and descendants continue to grapple with the emotional aftermath, highlighting how abuse reverberates across generations. The case emphasizes the importance of acknowledging past atrocities, documenting them meticulously, and using those records to inform modern systems of protection and justice. Despite the horrors, there is a thread of hope woven through the narrative. The actions taken by Henrietta, Tobias, and their allies demonstrate that even in the darkest circumstances, human agency can prevail. Their courage disrupted a cycle of exploitation and restored some measure of dignity to those who had been most oppressed. The children who survived, particularly Agnes's child, became living symbols of resilience and the possibility of a future untainted by the immediate horrors of the past. Historians often reflect on the moral complexities of the Branford story. Henrietta's orchestration of Silas's death, though technically an act of vigilante justice, was morally complicated but necessary. It raises enduring questions about the limits of legal systems, the ethics of self-determined justice, and the responsibilities of those in positions of relative power to act when institutional protections fail. The broader lessons of the estate are stark. Power, unchecked and insulated by wealth or social norms, can corrupt absolutely. Authority can mask depravity, and societal structures often fail to protect the most vulnerable. Yet, equally, the story illustrates the enduring power of conscience, the possibility of resistance, and the capacity for human courage in the face of overwhelming evil. In the decades following the events at Branford Estate, the region slowly changed. Reconstruction efforts, the eventual end of slavery, and shifts in societal attitudes altered the landscape of human rights. But the memories persisted, not in public records, but in private accounts, oral histories, and the quiet recollections of survivors and descendants. These personal narratives became crucial for historians seeking to understand the complex interplay of power, exploitation, and resistance in antebellum and postbellum America. The story of Branford Estate thus occupies a dual place in history. It is both a record of the depths of human cruelty and a testament to the resilience and courage of those who resist oppression. Agnes, Lucille, Henrietta, Tobias, and the others illustrate that even in situations designed to strip away autonomy and humanity, individuals can act decisively to reclaim control and protect the vulnerable. Their actions provide a framework for understanding resistance, not as a single heroic act, but as a network of courage, planning, and solidarity in the face of overwhelming odds. Ultimately, Branford Estate serves as a warning and a guide. It warns of the dangers of unaccountable authority, societal indifference, and the normalization of cruelty. It guides us toward recognizing the potential for resistance, the importance of documentation and testimony, and the enduring impact of trauma and recovery. The lessons drawn from this story resonate far beyond the Mississippi Delta, illuminating universal truths about power, responsibility, and the human capacity for both destruction and redemption. Even today, when historians and visitors walk the overgrown fields where Branford Estate once stood, they are reminded of both the horror and the hope embedded in its soil. The shadows of the past linger, not as active threats, but as persistent reminders that vigilance, moral courage, and collective action are essential to protect the vulnerable and prevent the repetition of atrocities. The story of the Branford Estate, though rooted in the specific context of 1860s Louisiana, carries lessons for all times. It challenges us to confront uncomfortable truths about authority, complicity, and the consequences of silence. It highlights the enduring need for witnesses, for intervention, and for the protection of human dignity against the corrupting influences of greed and absolute power. And, above all, it reminds us that even in the darkest corners of history, human conscience can act to restore justice, reclaim humanity, and provide a legacy of courage for future generations. The Branford Estate slowly faded from immediate memory, but its legacy endured in the lives of those who had survived, and in the lessons historians and descendants would later extract from its history. By the late 1860s, Henrietta Branford had relocated her family to a small, modest home on the outskirts of a nearby town. It was far from the grand plantation house, but for her and her daughters, the physical distance was only the beginning of their recovery. Emotional distance from the horrors of the past would prove far more difficult to attain. Agnes, now a mother and young woman, faced the monumental task of raising her child while navigating the trauma she had endured. Her body bore the marks of repeated pregnancies and abusive treatment, but her mind carried an even heavier burden. Nightmares of past events haunted her sleep, and flashes of memory triggered panic and anxiety during waking hours. Though freed from her father's tyranny, the echoes of his control lingered, manifesting in hypervigilance and deep mistrust of men. Her child became both a source of hope and a constant reminder of the horrors she had endured, a living link to a world she longed to protect from harm. Lucille, by contrast, withdrew even further into solitude. Her trauma manifested as dissociation, a mental retreat into silence and observation rather than engagement. Though Henrietta worked tirelessly to provide care and support, Lucille remained largely unreachable. She avoided relationships with outsiders and often spent long hours walking the countryside, attempting to reconcile the person she had been forced to become with the girl she had once been. The psychological scars of captivity and forced complicity created a permanent divide between her and a society that could never fully understand her experiences. Henrietta, despite her own guilt and exhaustion, became a pillar for her daughters. She dedicated herself to rebuilding their lives, restoring some measure of safety, and providing education and opportunity where it had been systematically denied. Every decision she made was informed by the desire to repair what had been broken. From the small comforts of daily life to the broader mission of ensuring her daughters could reclaim agency over their futures. She meticulously documented their experiences, understanding that the truth of the Branford estate must be preserved, even if society at large would continue to overlook it. The former slaves who had survived the estate faced a similarly complex post-liberation reality. Tobias's journey northward represented both freedom and dislocation. He carried with him a deep understanding of the psychological and moral compromises forced upon him during his time at Branford. He had acted decisively to end Silas's tyranny, but the memories of having facilitated atrocities against his fellow humans albeit under duress, haunted him. In New Orleans and beyond, he struggled to integrate into a society that offered freedom but not absolution, finding community among other freedmen and sympathetic allies who could partially share the burden of memory and guilt. Leah, meanwhile, rebuilt her life in New Orleans as a seamstress, quietly carving out a space for autonomy. Yet the trauma of forced reproduction and the loss of her child remained embedded in her psyche. She spoke little of her experiences, but those who came to know her noted a quiet intensity in her demeanor and a reserved mistrust of authority figures. Her survival, though marked by resilience, was inseparable from the pain of what she had endured, a testament to the enduring consequences of exploitation. Historians later analyzing the Branford estate observed a series of patterns that highlighted both the extremes of human cruelty and the potential for resistance. Silas Branford's actions demonstrated how social, legal, and economic structures can be twisted to perpetuate unimaginable abuses, even within one's family. His meticulous record, keeping, strategic manipulation of intermediaries in the slave market, and psychological control over both his daughters and enslaved workforce revealed a chilling rationality underpinning acts of monstrous cruelty. Yet, within this darkness, the courage of those who resisted cannot be understated. Henrietta's strategic planning, her alliances with Tobias and other enslaved men, and her decisive orchestration of Silas's demise illustrate the power of agency. Even under extreme oppression, resistance at Branford Estate was not spontaneous heroism, but a carefully coordinated response to systemic violence. It highlights how victims, even when severely constrained, can act decisively to reclaim autonomy and justice. The psychological aftermath for survivors remained profound. Agnes's and Lucille's lives were permanently altered, their mental and physical health bearing the weight of years of trauma. Their experiences serve as early historical examples of what modern psychology recognizes as complex post-traumatic stress disorder, prolonged exposure to systematic abuse, with ongoing threats to safety and autonomy. Henrietta's vigilance and care mitigated some effects, but the deep scars of both physical and emotional exploitation could never be entirely erased. The societal context of the era further compounded the difficulty of recovery. Post-Civil War reconstruction brought legal freedom for formerly enslaved people, but did not erase the social attitudes and prejudices that had allowed abuses like those at Branford Estate to occur. Women, particularly those of Southern aristocratic families, continued to navigate a culture steeped in patriarchal authority. For Henrietta and her daughters, this meant that recovery required not only confronting past abuses, but also negotiating a society that often undervalued their autonomy and dismissed the realities of domestic exploitation. The legacy of Branford Estate also extends to historical methodology and documentation. Henrietta's journals and Tobias's recollections, later corroborated with fragmented legal and commercial records, became essential in reconstructing the events of 1860 to 1863. Scholars recognized that without such primary sources, the scope of abuse and resistance would remain hidden. The case underscores the importance of detailed, personal testimony in understanding histories of extreme violence, particularly when official records are inadequate, misleading, or actively sanitized to protect perpetrators. Modern historians use Branford Estate to examine intersections of power, gender, race, and family dynamics. Silas Branford's manipulation of legal and social systems demonstrates the unique vulnerabilities created when authority goes unchecked. The estate exemplifies how patriarchy and slavery can be intertwined to create circumstances in which individuals rationalize extreme abuses against even the most intimate relations. The story forces reflection on how social norms, economic incentives, and legal structures can converge to enable systematic cruelty. Equally important is the story of resistance. Henrietta, Tobias, and the loyal enslaved men demonstrate the potential for solidarity and moral courage under conditions designed to strip away agency. Their planning and execution of Silas's removal reveal a sophisticated understanding of power dynamics, risk management, and strategy, an early instance of collective action against oppression within a household context. Their courage highlights how resistance is not only possible, but often necessary to restore justice when institutional avenues fail. The psychological effects of Branford Estate's horrors did not end with the deaths of Silas or Frida. Agnes, Lucille, and other survivors navigated ongoing challenges in forming relationships, trusting authority, and integrating into post-war society. Their experiences illustrate intergenerational trauma, the phenomenon by which extreme abuse and oppression create ripples of psychological, social, and emotional consequences that extend beyond the immediate victims. Descendants of the estate's survivors would later report family stories marked by silence, caution, and heightened awareness of personal boundaries, a living legacy of historical trauma. Yet even amidst these tragedies, threads of resilience persisted. Agnes's child became a symbol of hope and continuity, a tangible reminder that life, even when scarred by abuse, could continue. Henrietta's dedication to preserving memory ensured that the abuses of the estate were neither forgotten nor sanitized. Leah and Tobias, by asserting agency and surviving, contributed to a narrative of endurance, demonstrating the possibility of rebuilding even in the aftermath of extreme oppression. Branford Estate also serves as a cautionary tale for contemporary society. It reminds us that abuses of power often occur within the most intimate spaces, and that social respectability can mask profound cruelty. The estate exemplifies how systems of authority, legal, familial, and economic, can be manipulated to exploit vulnerability. In studying such cases, modern observers gain insight into the mechanisms of abuse, the dynamics of complicity, and the ways in which resistance can manifest. Ultimately, the story of Branford Estate is both tragic and instructive. It forces acknowledgement of the human capacity for both cruelty and courage, for oppression and resistance. While Silas Branford's actions exemplified the depths of moral corruption, the bravery of Henrietta, Tobias, and others demonstrates that justice and redemption can emerge even in environments designed to suppress them. Today, the land that once held Branford Estate is quiet. Crops grow where cruelty once flourished, and nature has slowly reclaimed spaces of trauma. Yet the echoes of the past endure, carried not by ghosts but by memory, testimony, and the ongoing work of descendants and historians committed to truth. The legacy of the estate continues to challenge us to confront uncomfortable histories, recognize the enduring effects of trauma, and value the courage required to act against injustice. The story compels reflection on accountability, moral courage, and the responsibility of witnesses. It reminds us that authority, when unchecked, can perpetuate abuse, but also that collective action, careful planning, and moral resolve can disrupt even the most entrenched systems of oppression. The survivors' stories provide both warning and hope, warning of the dangers of power abused, and hope in the enduring capacity for human conscience to act decisively in defense of the vulnerable. Branford Estate's narrative is a stark illustration of how personal greed, societal indifference, and systemic inequities can converge to produce unprecedented cruelty. Yet it also affirms the transformative power of resistance and moral courage. Henrietta, her daughters, and the formerly enslaved men who acted alongside her demonstrated that even in circumstances of extreme power imbalance, the human spirit can find avenues to restore justice and reclaim dignity. In the final analysis, Branford Estate offers a profound lesson for all generations. That vigilance, moral courage, and the willingness to confront evil are essential. While the estate's horrors were real and deeply consequential, the actions of those who resisted remind us that justice, however delayed or complicated, remains achievable. Through careful documentation, collective action, and a refusal to remain silent, the survivors of Branford Estate left a legacy that transcends their immediate suffering. one that continues to speak to our understanding of power, trauma, and resilience today. Though the Branford estate had been dismantled, and its horrors buried with time, the echoes of its legacy persisted in ways both subtle and profound. For survivors like Henrietta, Agnes, and Lucille, life after the estate was not simply a matter of freedom. It was a daily negotiation with memories that refused to fade. Each sunrise brought with it reminders of what had been lost, what had been endured, and the immense responsibility of moving forward while carrying the scars of the past. Henrietta's life became a careful balancing act between nurturing her daughters and maintaining her own fragile mental health. Though she had acted decisively to end her husband's reign of terror, the guilt of not acting sooner was ever present. Nights were the hardest. She often awoke from nightmares of Frida, reliving the image of her youngest daughter in the attic, and wondered if she could have prevented that tragedy. These thoughts, painful yet unrelenting, shaped every decision she made for her remaining children. She devoted herself to ensuring Agnes and Lucille would never again be vulnerable to such exploitation, investing in their education, health, and psychological recovery. Agnes, now older and more resilient, approached her life with a cautious optimism. She cherished her child, seeing in them a second chance at a normal life. Yet the traumas of the past, repeated forced pregnancies, the loss of siblings, and the abuse at the hands of her father, left indelible marks. Her relationships were complicated by distrust, particularly toward men, and her autonomy became a fiercely guarded aspect of her identity. She spent hours documenting her experiences, ensuring that the truth of Branford estate would survive, even if the world remained reluctant to acknowledge it. Lucille's path was quieter, though no less profound. Her trauma manifested in withdrawal, introspection, and careful observation of the world around her. Though she never spoke at length about her experiences, her demeanor carried a weight that those close to her recognized immediately. She became a figure of quiet resilience, teaching younger generations through example rather than words, demonstrating that survival often required strength born of internal fortitude rather than external validation. The former slaves of the Branford estate also struggled with the lingering consequences of forced complicity. Tobias, in particular, faced a lifelong reckoning with his role in both aiding and resisting Branford's tyranny. Though he had acted decisively to eliminate the threat posed by Silas, the memories of being coerced into facilitating abuse haunted him. His journey north was both liberation and exile, as he navigated freedom in a society that could not fully comprehend or validate the moral compromises he had endured. Yet he remained committed to building a life of integrity, seeking communities where trust and justice could flourish, and mentoring younger freedmen in resilience and moral courage. Lia's post-estate life was a testament to perseverance in the face of trauma. She built a modest existence in New Orleans, working as a seamstress and creating a home of her own. Though she carried the emotional scars of forced participation in Branford's reproductive scheme, she found solace in the small acts of autonomy she could exercise daily. Her survival was both literal and symbolic, representing the capacity of individuals to reclaim agency and identity after enduring systematic dehumanization. Historically, Branford estate serves as a dark mirror of societal failure and moral corruption. Silas Branford's actions, executed with meticulous planning, legal manipulation, and psychological precision, illustrate the extent to which power, unchecked authority, and social complicity can foster extreme abuses. He exploited every facet of social and legal structures to achieve his personal gain, showing how even familial bonds could be twisted into tools of oppression. Scholars studying the estate note that Branford's methodical approach, tracking reproductive cycles, falsifying documents, and orchestrating sales through intermediaries, demonstrates a calculated cruelty that transcended impulsive violence, revealing a chilling efficiency in the commodification of human life. Yet within this bleak historical context, acts of resistance illuminate pathways of moral courage and ingenuity. Henrietta's strategic alliances with Tobias and other enslaved men underscore the potential for collective action, even under conditions of extreme vulnerability. Their plan to eliminate Silas, executed with precision and secrecy, highlights how intelligence, courage, and collaboration can disrupt systems of oppression. Resistance at Branford Estate was not born of spontaneous heroism, but of careful calculation and shared ethical resolve, a model for understanding how oppressed individuals navigate impossible circumstances. The psychological aftermath for survivors cannot be overstated. Agnes, Lucille, and others endured long-term effects now recognized as complex post-traumatic stress disorder. Nightmares, dissociation, hypervigilance, and mistrust were common threads, influencing their relationships, social integration, and capacity for intimacy. While Henrietta's care mitigated some of the effects, the psychological scars persisted, demonstrating the enduring impact of systematic abuse and forced exploitation. These experiences offer historical insight into trauma's intergenerational and long-lasting effects, emphasizing the necessity of recognition, support, and documentation. The societal backdrop of Branford Estate further magnified its horrors. Southern post-Civil War society offered legal freedom, but little social validation or protection for survivors of domestic abuse. Women like Henrietta had to navigate a culture that undervalued their autonomy and often disregarded the severity of domestic exploitation. The absence of legal recourse highlighted the importance of personal initiative in seeking justice and protecting the vulnerable. A theme that resonates in historical analyses of systemic oppression. Branford Estate's records, particularly Henrietta's diaries and Tobias's recollections, became crucial for historians seeking to reconstruct the events accurately. These sources reveal both the meticulous cruelty of Silas Branford and the strategic resilience of those who opposed him. The estate's history demonstrates the importance of personal testimony in preserving narratives of abuse that official records often sanitize or omit. Scholars note that such first-hand accounts are indispensable for understanding the mechanisms of power, manipulation, and resistance within oppressive systems. Modern analysis of Branford Estate emphasizes intersections of power, gender, race, and familial dynamics. Silas Branford's manipulation of legal and social norms reveals how authority can be weaponized to exploit vulnerability, even within one's family. The estate exemplifies how patriarchal and economic systems can converge to enable extreme abuse, creating circumstances where the moral compass of individuals is subverted by opportunity, greed, and societal complicity. Conversely, the actions of Henrietta and her allies provide a blueprint for understanding resistance under extreme conditions. The coordination, discretion, and moral clarity displayed in planning Silas's removal underscore the capacity for human conscience to assert itself, even when formal mechanisms of justice fail. These acts of defiance demonstrate that collective moral action can be both strategic and effective, offering lessons for historical and contemporary contexts alike. The psychological effects of the estate were not limited to immediate survivors. Descendants of survivors experienced inherited trauma, reflecting the intergenerational impact of systematic abuse. Stories passed down quietly through families became imbued with caution, resilience, and moral instruction. Such narratives underscore how trauma extends beyond the individual, shaping familial and communal memory for generations. Yet, even amidst enduring pain, survival and resilience are evident. Agnes's child, born after the fall of Branford Estate, symbolizes continuity and hope. Laya's life in New Orleans, marked by autonomy and skill, demonstrates the capacity for individuals to rebuild. Henrietta's dedication to preserving memory and ensuring care for her daughters ensured that the truth of Branford Estate remained accessible to future generations, emphasizing the importance of historical preservation in confronting past atrocities. Branford Estate also provides contemporary society with critical lessons about authority, morality, and vigilance. The estate demonstrates how seemingly ordinary individuals can commit extraordinary atrocities when social structures, legal systems, and cultural norms are manipulated to support unchecked power. It underscores the importance of critical oversight, moral accountability, and the courage to act against systemic abuses, particularly when institutional mechanisms fail. Ultimately, Branford Estate serves as a lens through which to explore the duality of human nature, the capacity for profound cruelty, and the potential for extraordinary courage. Silas Branford's calculated exploitation of his own family reveals the depths of human depravity, while Henrietta, Tobias, and others illustrate the enduring potential for moral resistance and restoration. Their story affirms that even under conditions of extreme oppression, agency, courage, and collective action can produce meaningful change. Today, the land that once held Branford Estate is quiet, its fields peaceful, its structures long gone. Nature has slowly reclaimed the space, offering an external calm that belies the intense suffering once endured there. Yet the history of Branford Estate persists, carried in memory, testimony, and scholarly reconstruction. It stands as a cautionary tale, a reminder of the consequences of unchecked authority, and a testament to human resilience. In studying Branford Estate, we confront uncomfortable truths about power, exploitation, and societal complicity. We witness both the extremes of human depravity and the heights of courage possible when individuals confront injustice decisively. Henrietta's bravery, though belated, exemplifies moral courage under impossible circumstances. Tobias and other former slaves demonstrate that solidarity can transcend societal divisions and produce collective justice, even when institutional systems fail. The estate's story compels reflection on vigilance, ethical responsibility, and the ongoing fight against oppression in all forms. It reminds us that history is not simply a chronicle of events, but a repository of moral lessons. Survivors' testimonies, carefully preserved, demand recognition and action, ensuring that the injustices of the past inform the moral consciousness of future generations. Even decades later, the legacy of Branford Estate continues to resonate. Historians, descendants, and social scholars alike revisit its narratives to understand how power can be abused, how trauma is transmitted, and how resilience emerges under extreme conditions. The story of Henrietta and her daughters remains a powerful illustration of the human capacity to resist, survive, and assert justice, no matter how formidable the obstacles. Branford Estate forces us to consider uncomfortable questions. How do ordinary people become complicit in extraordinary evil? How do survivors navigate the aftermath of systematic abuse? And, crucially, how can society recognize, prevent, and respond to such horrors before they escalate? The estate's lessons extend beyond its historical moment, offering enduring insights into the human condition, the dynamics of power, and the moral imperatives of vigilance and intervention. In the quiet fields where Branford Estate once stood, the wind whispers not with supernatural menace, but with the memory of suffering, resistance, and moral courage. Those who walked its halls and worked its fields left an indelible mark on history, a legacy that continues to teach, warn, and inspire. Their stories challenge us to confront cruelty wherever it exists, to act decisively in defense of the vulnerable, and to remember that even the darkest chapters of history can illuminate paths toward justice, redemption, and resilience. The story of Branford Estate endures not only as a historical case study, but as a moral testament. It reminds us that evil often operates under the guise of normalcy, that human conscience can be suppressed, but not entirely extinguished, and that even in the most desperate circumstances, courage, solidarity, and moral action remain possible. The estate's history, with its interwoven narratives of suffering, exploitation, and resistance, continues to demand reflection, remembrance, and commitment to justice, ensuring that the lessons of the past remain relevant for all who confront the challenges of the present. The final chapter of Branford Estate is not marked by grandiose monuments or public acknowledgement, but by the quiet persistence of memory, resilience, and historical reflection. With Silas Branford gone, Henrietta and her surviving daughters faced the monumental task of rebuilding lives that had been systematically shattered. The years following their liberation were defined by the painstaking process of healing, documenting the atrocities, and forging a sense of normalcy in a world that remained indifferent to their suffering. Henrietta became both caregiver and historian, ensuring that the truth of Branford Estate would not be lost. She meticulously recorded events in her diaries, chronicling not only the crimes of Silas, but also the acts of courage and solidarity that had ultimately saved their lives. Her writings served multiple purposes: a therapeutic outlet, a guide for understanding trauma, and a testament to the resilience of those who survived. Through her work, Henrietta transformed personal anguish into a lasting historical record, one that scholars would later rely upon to reconstruct the grim realities of the plantation. Agnes, now grown, approached her life with a careful vigilance. The birth of her child after the fall of Branford Estate was a bittersweet triumph, symbolizing continuity and hope amidst the shadows of the past. Yet the trauma of repeated forced pregnancies, the loss of siblings, and the abuse inflicted by her father left deep psychological scars. Her early experiences shaped her approach to motherhood, relationships, and autonomy. She became fiercely protective of her family, instilling in her child an awareness of resilience and the moral imperative to stand against injustice. Her life exemplified the long-term effects of trauma and the ways in which survivors negotiate autonomy in the aftermath of systematic exploitation. Lucille, by contrast, embraced a quieter form of resilience. She refrained from speaking extensively about the horrors she had endured, instead letting her actions communicate her strength. She became a mentor and figure of guidance within her community, quietly demonstrating the value of observation, discernment, and strategic thinking as tools for survival. Her story highlights the varied forms that healing and resistance can take, showing that recovery need not be loud to be profound. The former slaves of Branford Estate also faced the ongoing consequences of their coerced involvement in Silas's schemes. Tobias, having helped orchestrate Silas's demise, carried the weight of both guilt and pride. His moral compass had been tested under impossible conditions, forced to navigate complicity and resistance simultaneously. Moving north, Tobias sought to build a life rooted in integrity, freedom, and community. He became a mentor to other freedmen, sharing lessons on moral courage, strategic action, and the importance of solidarity in resisting oppression. His journey underscored the psychological complexity faced by those who are forced into morally compromising roles, even when their actions ultimately contribute to justice. Laya, too, worked to reclaim agency and autonomy after the estate's liberation. Settling in New Orleans, she found work as a seamstress and rebuilt her life away from the shadow of Branford Estate. Though her memories of forced participation and personal loss remained vivid, she cultivated small victories in daily life: financial independence, personal security, and control over her own household. Her story illustrates the potential for survivors to reclaim dignity and agency, even when the physical and emotional consequences of abuse remain. Historically, Branford Estate stands as a chilling case study of systemic abuse and moral corruption. Silas Branford's actions, meticulously planned, legally manipulative, and psychologically calculated, reveal the extreme lengths to which individuals can exploit power structures to achieve personal gain. His manipulation of laws, social norms, and familial bonds underscores the dangers inherent in unbridled authority. Scholars examining the estate note that Branford's approach, tracking reproductive cycles, falsifying documents, and orchestrating sales through intermediaries, demonstrates a methodical and premeditated cruelty that goes beyond impulsive acts, highlighting the potential for human depravity when societal oversight fails. Yet within this bleak context, acts of resistance illuminate paths of moral courage. Henrietta's alliance with Tobias and the other slaves illustrates the capacity for strategic action in the face of overwhelming oppression. Their careful planning and execution of Silas's removal demonstrate that ethical and practical reasoning can intersect to confront injustice, even when formal legal systems fail. Resistance at Branford Estate was not the product of impulsive heroism. It emerged from deliberate, calculated choices, offering lessons on the dynamics of oppression and the strategies available for countering it. The psychological aftermath for survivors of Branford Estate underscores the enduring impact of systemic abuse. Agnes Lucille and other women exhibited symptoms now understood as post-traumatic stress disorder nightmares, hypervigilance, emotional numbness, and profound mistrust. These conditions shaped their adult lives, influencing relationships, career choices, and social interactions. Henrietta's care mitigated some effects, but the long-term consequences of such sustained trauma remained evident. The estate serves as an historical example of how severe psychological abuse can persist across lifespans, emphasizing the importance of recognition, support, and historical documentation. The societal framework of the period further magnified the estate's horrors. Southern post-Civil War society offered legal emancipation, but limited social validation or protection for survivors of domestic abuse. Women like Henrietta had to navigate a world that undervalued their autonomy and frequently minimized the severity of domestic exploitation. The absence of reliable legal recourse highlighted the critical importance of personal initiative and moral courage in protecting vulnerable individuals. Branford Estate thus illustrates the ways in which systemic structures can fail to safeguard victims, reinforcing the need for vigilance and advocacy. Records from the estate, including Henrietta's diaries and Tobias's recollections, are invaluable for historians. These sources provide both a detailed account of Silas's calculated abuses and a record of resistance and resilience. Scholars note that such first-hand documentation is essential for reconstructing the realities of systemic abuse, revealing how authority can be manipulated and how moral courage can emerge under extreme conditions. These narratives demonstrate the necessity of preserving survivor testimony in order to understand both the mechanics of oppression and the strategies of resistance. The story of Branford Estate also offers broader lessons about power, morality, and social responsibility. Silas Branford's exploitation of his own family shows how authority, when unchecked, can be weaponized against those closest to the perpetrator. Patriarchal norms, economic motivations, and social complicity converge to create circumstances where extreme abuse was both possible and hidden from scrutiny. In contrast, the coordinated action of Henrietta and her allies illustrates that moral agency can prevail, even under dire conditions, highlighting the potential for justice when individuals act decisively. Intergenerational trauma further extends the estate's legacy. Descendants of survivors carry memories and moral lessons passed down through family narratives. These stories, often shared quietly, instill lessons of caution, resilience, and ethical responsibility. They reveal the long-term consequences of abuse on familial structures and underscore the importance of acknowledgement and remembrance in mitigating historical trauma. Despite the pervasive suffering, the narrative of Branford Estate is not without hope. The survival of Agnes Lucille and Leah demonstrates the capacity for human resilience. Their lives, while marked by trauma, also reflect agency, healing, and moral integrity. Henrietta's preservation of their story ensures that the estate's dark history remains a source of learning, reflection, and moral instruction for future generations. The estate's historical significance lies not only in its extreme abuses, but also in its lessons on human behavior and social structures. It highlights how ordinary people, given the right combination of power, societal permissiveness, and personal ambition, can commit extraordinary acts of cruelty. It also underscores the capacity of moral courage to intervene, even when institutional systems are ineffective or absent. The contrast between oppression and resistance at Branford Estate provides critical insights into the dynamics of authority, the mechanisms of abuse, and the strategies of ethical intervention. The physical landscape of Branford Estate has long since been reclaimed by nature. Fields that once bore witness to cruelty now flourish quietly, the remnants of buildings gone. Yet the historical memory of the estate persists, embedded in personal accounts, historical research, and the moral consciousness of those who study it. These memories serve as both a warning and a guide, reminding us that vigilance, empathy, and ethical courage are essential in countering injustice. The story of Branford Estate confronts us with difficult questions. How do systems allow atrocities to flourish? How do individuals navigate complicity, coercion, and resistance? And what is the role of memory and testimony in ensuring that past abuses inform present moral action? These questions are not merely historical, they resonate in contemporary discussions about domestic abuse, exploitation, and systemic injustice. The estate exemplifies both the dangers of unchecked authority and the potential for moral action to confront and disrupt it. Ultimately, Branford Estate is a study in dualities, the extremes of human cruelty and the heights of moral courage, oppression and resistance, despair and resilience. Silas Branford's calculated exploitation of his family contrasts starkly with Henrietta, Tobias, and the other survivors' acts of defiance, demonstrating that even in environments of extreme control, human agency can assert itself. The estate's history affirms the enduring importance of conscience, solidarity, and strategic action in confronting injustice. In the quiet fields where Branford Estate once stood, the wind carries memories of suffering, resilience, and moral courage. Survivors' stories endure as a testament to human endurance, a call to vigilance, and a reminder that justice, though sometimes delayed or unconventional, remains possible. Branford Estate challenges us to confront the depths of human depravity, while also celebrating the capacity for courage, resistance, and ethical action. Through its history, Branford Estate teaches that systemic oppression can exist, even in seemingly ordinary environments. That personal and collective action is crucial in confronting abuse, and that the legacies of trauma and resilience can span generations. The estate's story demands reflection, ethical engagement, and a commitment to remembering and acting in the face of injustice. It remains a dark yet instructive chapter in the history of human morality, power, and survival. Even as the physical structures of Branford Estate have vanished, its moral and historical lessons remain. The estate stands as a stark reminder of the need for vigilance, the consequences of unchecked authority, and the enduring human capacity for resistance and resilience. Henrietta, Agnes, Lucille, Leah, and Tobias embody both the suffering imposed by systemic abuse and the potential for courage and justice, ensuring that the estate's story continues to educate, warn, and inspire future generations. Long after the Branford Estate ceased to exist as a functioning plantation, the repercussions of Silas Branford's reign of terror lingered in the lives of those who survived. For Henrietta, Agnes, Lucille, and the former slaves, the journey toward recovery was neither linear nor easy. The trauma inflicted over years of calculated abuse left indelible marks, physical, emotional, and psychological. Yet, through their stories, historians, descendants, and society at large are reminded of both the depths of human cruelty and the heights of moral courage. The psychological consequences of Branford Estate's horrors persisted for decades. Agnes, despite raising a child in relative safety, carried the echoes of her repeated exploitation, loss of siblings, and coerced compliance. The early normalization of fear, control, and commodification of her body influenced her ability to trust others, form relationships, and even engage in ordinary acts of joy. Her resilience was remarkable, but it existed alongside a constant awareness of vulnerability and the fragility of personal safety. Lucille, in her quiet way, transformed trauma into vigilance. By teaching, mentoring, and observing, she ensured that the lessons of the estate could be passed forward without directly reliving the atrocities. Henrietta's role as chronicler and protector became central to preserving the truth. Through diaries, letters, and oral testimony, she ensured that the systematic abuse orchestrated by Silas Branford would not be lost to history. These records provide an unflinching account of events, allowing historians and social scientists to study the mechanisms of abuse, complicity, and resistance. More importantly, they document the moral courage that emerged when formal systems failed. Tobias's involvement, alongside other slaves who risked their lives to help the Branford women, offers a stark reminder that resistance is possible even under oppressive circumstances. The historical context of Branford Estate underscores the vulnerabilities inherent in the social, legal, and patriarchal systems of the American South during the mid-19th century. Southern laws protected patriarchal authority, allowed absolute control over women and enslaved people, and often normalized cruelty under the guise of discipline or economic necessity. Silas Branford exploited these structures with meticulous calculation, demonstrating how societal permissiveness, legal loopholes, and moral indifference can facilitate extreme abuse. His ability to manipulate laws, social norms, and family bonds exemplifies how systemic power can be weaponized to harm even those closest to the abuser. Branford Estate also illustrates the concept of moral complicity. Dr. McCormick, Sheriff Mullins, and others who were aware of irregularities yet chose to ignore them reveal how societal structures often fail the most vulnerable. McCormick's initial silence, motivated by financial incentives, and Mullins's superficial investigation show the limitations of institutional oversight in protecting individuals from abuse, particularly when perpetrators occupy positions of respect and authority. These failures highlight the enduring importance of moral accountability beyond formal legal structures. The stories of resistance, however, are equally instructive. Henrietta's alliance with Tobias and other enslaved individuals demonstrates how solidarity and strategic thinking can overcome oppressive systems. Their calculated decision to remove Silas Branford was not impulsive, but meticulously planned, highlighting the interplay of courage, pragmatism, and ethical determination in moments of moral crisis. This aspect of the narrative provides enduring lessons on how ordinary people can confront extraordinary evil when formal justice is absent or ineffective. Intergenerational trauma was a profound legacy of Branford Estate. Survivors and their descendants bore the consequences of physical abuse, psychological coercion, and the commodification of family members. The experiences of Agnes, Lucille, and Leah show how trauma manifests differently across lifespans, influencing personality, behavior, and life choices. This intergenerational transmission underscores the need for both historical awareness and psychological support when addressing systemic abuse. By understanding the long-term consequences, society can better recognize patterns of trauma and provide avenues for healing. The broader societal implications of Branford Estate resonate in contemporary discussions of domestic abuse, sexual exploitation, and systemic oppression. Modern parallels can be drawn in situations where individuals in positions of authority exploit trust and power for personal gain, often operating in environments where legal protections are insufficient. Branford Estate reminds us that extreme abuses are rarely isolated incidents, but are facilitated by systemic permissiveness, societal indifference, and cultural norms that protect abusers. Awareness of these dynamics is crucial for preventing, identifying, and addressing abuse today. Memorialization and historical documentation are essential in ensuring that the legacy of Branford Estate is not forgotten. While the physical structures of the plantation no longer exist, the narratives preserved by survivors like Henrietta provide a vivid record of human resilience and moral courage. These stories allow contemporary audiences to engage critically with history, understand the mechanisms of abuse, and recognize the moral imperatives that emerge in extreme circumstances. Preserving such histories is vital not only for honoring victims, but also for educating future generations about the consequences of unchecked power and the importance of ethical action. Tobias's post-liberation journey exemplifies the long-term challenges faced by those who resist systemic oppression. Moving north to establish a life of freedom, he grappled with the psychological burden of coerced complicity and the moral weight of participating in clandestine acts of justice. His story highlights the complexity of resistance, where actions taken to restore justice can carry enduring personal consequences. Yet, Tobias's ability to mentor and support other freed individuals demonstrates how resilience, moral courage, and community engagement can transform personal trauma into collective empowerment. Laya's post-estate life further illustrates the intersection of personal recovery and societal constraints. Settling in New Orleans, she rebuilt her life from the fragments of trauma, asserting independence and reclaiming agency over her own body and labor. Her experience underscores the enduring impact of systemic abuse on personal identity, autonomy, and trust, while also highlighting the capacity for resilience and reinvention in the aftermath of oppression. Laya's story demonstrates that survival, though difficult, can serve as a platform for empowerment and moral reconstruction. The psychological and moral dimensions of Branford Estate provide a framework for understanding both historical and contemporary abuse. Silas Branford's calculated cruelty illustrates how individuals can rationalize inhumane actions through self-justification, financial incentive, and social permissiveness. Conversely, Henrietta and her allies demonstrate how ethical reflection, strategic planning, and courage can disrupt cycles of oppression, even when conventional justice fails. The interplay of abuse and resistance offers profound lessons for scholars, policymakers, and anyone concerned with human rights and social justice. One of the most enduring lessons of Branford Estate is the necessity of vigilance and moral responsibility. Societies that fail to monitor, regulate, and intervene in abusive situations inadvertently enable extreme forms of exploitation. The estate demonstrates that monsters are rarely faceless strangers. They are often embedded within social structures, cloaked in respectability, and empowered by systemic inertia. Recognizing this reality is critical for both historical understanding and contemporary application. Today, Branford Estate serves as a symbolic site of memory, morality, and caution. Although the physical land is cultivated peacefully, the ethical landscape remains charged with the echoes of past atrocities. Scholars, descendants, and advocates study its history to illuminate patterns of abuse, explore the dynamics of resistance, and reflect on the moral challenges posed by concentrated power. The story reminds us that ethical courage often requires unconventional action, and that justice may sometimes emerge outside formal, legal structures. The surviving narratives of Branford Estate also contribute to broader discourses on gender, race, and power. The estate's abuses highlight the ways patriarchal authority can intersect with economic incentives to produce extreme exploitation. They also underscore the moral complexity of individuals operating within oppressive systems, demonstrating that resistance can take multiple forms, from covert defiance to strategic action. These lessons resonate with contemporary struggles for justice, equality, and protection of vulnerable populations. In conclusion, Branford Estate exemplifies the duality of human experience, the capacity for unimaginable cruelty, alongside the potential for extraordinary courage. The estate's history demonstrates how systemic power can be exploited to perpetuate abuse, but it also illustrates the transformative power of moral action, solidarity, and resilience. Henrietta, Agnes, Lucille, Laya, and Tobias embody both the suffering imposed by systemic oppression and the potential for ethical resistance. Their stories remind us that history is not only a record of atrocities, but also a testament to human agency, courage, and the pursuit of justice. As we reflect on Branford Estate, we are challenged to recognize the signs of systemic abuse in all contexts, to honor the resilience of survivors, and to ensure that moral courage is both acknowledged and supported. The legacy of Branford Estate is a somber but necessary reminder. Vigilance, empathy, and ethical responsibility are essential for preventing abuse and promoting justice, whether in historical contexts or contemporary society. The story of Branford Estate, though rooted in the 19th century, reverberates across time. It compels us to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature, societal complicity, and the fragility of ethical norms in the face of power and greed. Yet, it also offers hope, demonstrating that even in environments of extreme oppression, human conscience, solidarity, and courage can prevail. When the wind sweeps across the Mississippi Delta, over lands that once bore witness to suffering, one can almost hear the echoes of Branford Estate, not as spectral hauntings, but as persistent reminders of resilience, moral courage, and the enduring importance of bearing witness. The tale of Branford Estate endures as a moral compass, a historical lesson, and a testament to the human capacity to survive, resist, and rebuild. It calls us to remember, reflect, and act, ensuring that the injustices of the past inform our vigilance in the present and our ethical responsibility toward the vulnerable in the future. Even decades after the final chapters of Branford Estate unfolded, the echoes of its horrors continued to shape the lives of those who survived, as well as the communities around them. The plantation itself, long since sold and parceled into farmland, could not erase the memory of what had occurred within its walls. Local residents, descendants, and historians alike spoke of the estate in hushed tones, as if the soil still held the weight of trauma. In this way, Branford Estate became more than a site of physical cruelty. It became a symbol of the moral failures and possibilities of its era. Henrietta, who had meticulously documented the events of the estate, emerged as an essential figure in preserving this history. Her detailed accounts, letters, and diaries provided insight into both the mechanisms of abuse and the acts of resistance that ultimately ended Silas Branford's reign of terror. Through her writing, she offered future generations a chance to witness the human cost of unchecked power, the corruption of familial authority, and the resilience required to confront such evil. Her work became a foundational resource for scholars studying slavery, domestic abuse, and systemic oppression. The surviving daughters, Agnes, Lucille, and Arlene, lived lives marked by the indelible scars of their experiences. Physical recovery was only part of their journey. The psychological impact was profound and lifelong. Arlene, who had endured the repeated trauma of forced pregnancies and the loss of her children, faced deep emotional challenges in forming relationships and rebuilding a sense of agency. Lucille, who had assumed the role of observer and educator, channeled her trauma into mentorship and advocacy, ensuring that the lessons of Branford Estate were not lost. Agnes, navigating a precarious path between survival and recovery, embodied both the fragility and resilience of the human spirit in the face of prolonged abuse. The former slaves who participated in the clandestine resistance, most notably Tobias, also carried the burden of their experiences. Though they had acted to protect the women and ultimately played a role in ending Silas Branford's reign, they were haunted by memories of coercion, complicity, and the moral ambiguity of survival under oppression. Tobias's post-liberation life, spent establishing a home and mentoring others, became a testament to the capacity for redemption, resilience, and the rebuilding of community bonds after systemic violence. Branford Estate also serves as a case study in systemic abuse and moral complicity. The legal, social, and cultural frameworks of the antebellum South allowed Silas Branford to exploit absolute patriarchal authority and manipulate both his family and the enslaved population without fear of accountability. Figures like Dr. McCormick and Sheriff Mullins, who were aware of irregularities but failed to intervene, exemplify the limitations of societal oversight and the dangers of passive complicity. Their failure to act underscores the necessity of ethical vigilance and proactive intervention, particularly in contexts where vulnerable individuals are at risk. The estate's history provides critical insight into the dynamics of power, control, and moral rationalization. Silas Branford's ability to dehumanize his own daughters, treating them as commodities to be managed, exploited, and sold, reflects a broader pattern of moral corruption enabled by social structures and legal permissiveness. His meticulous calculations, strategic planning, and cold rationalizations illustrate how individuals can normalize extreme cruelty when societal incentives align perversely with personal gain. Yet, the resistance enacted by Henrietta, Tobias, and their allies demonstrates the potential for ethical action, even under conditions of extreme constraint. Intergenerational trauma emerged as a pervasive consequence of Branford estate. The psychological impact of repeated abuse, forced reproductive labor, and the commodification of family members persisted across lifespans, affecting not only the immediate survivors, but also subsequent generations. This trauma manifested in profound emotional challenges, difficulties in forming intimate relationships, and a pervasive sense of vulnerability and mistrust. Understanding these long-term consequences provides critical lessons for contemporary approaches to trauma, informed care and social support, emphasizing the enduring influence of systemic abuse. The broader societal implications of Branford estate remain relevant today. Situations of domestic abuse, sexual exploitation, and systemic oppression often mirror the dynamics observed on the estate, where authority figures exploit trust, coercion, and social structures to perpetuate harm. Branford estate serves as a cautionary tale, highlighting the dangers of societal indifference, inadequate legal protections, and the normalization of power imbalances. Recognizing these patterns is essential for preventing, identifying, and addressing abuse in contemporary contexts. Memorialization and historical preservation play a critical role in ensuring that the lessons of Branford estate endure. While the physical structures have vanished, the narratives preserved by survivors offer a vivid record of human resilience, ethical courage, and systemic failure. These stories allow contemporary audiences to engage critically with history, understand the mechanisms of abuse, and reflect on the moral imperatives that arise in extreme circumstances. Preserving such histories honors the experiences of victims and provides guidance for addressing injustice in the present. The ethical and moral dimensions of Branford estate continue to resonate in academic, legal, and cultural discussions. Silas Branford's calculated cruelty demonstrates how individuals can rationalize inhumane actions when societal norms, financial incentives, and patriarchal authority converge. Conversely, the resistance enacted by Henrietta, Tobias, and other allies illustrates how strategic planning, moral courage, and solidarity can disrupt cycles of abuse, even when conventional justice systems fail. These lessons remain relevant for scholars, policymakers, and advocates committed to protecting vulnerable populations. Tobias's post-liberation journey exemplifies the complexity of moral agency under oppression. Although he had participated in clandestine acts of justice, he carried the psychological burden of coerced complicity and the moral weight of living with memories of atrocities. His ability to rebuild his life, mentor others, and contribute to community resilience reflects the transformative potential of ethical action and underscores the importance of agency and empowerment in post-traumatic recovery. Laya's post-estate life similarly highlights the interplay between trauma, recovery, and agency. Settling in New Orleans, she rebuilt her life, asserting independence and reclaiming control over her labor, body, and choices. Her journey underscores the enduring consequences of systemic abuse, while demonstrating the capacity for personal empowerment, resilience, and reconstruction of identity. Laya's story exemplifies how survivors of extreme trauma can reclaim agency, even in the shadow of past horrors. Branford estate offers critical lessons for understanding the dynamics of gender, power, and systemic oppression. The exploitation of patriarchal authority, the manipulation of legal structures, and the commodification of family members highlight how systemic power can facilitate extreme abuse. Simultaneously, the acts of resistance by Henrietta and her allies illustrate how ethical courage and strategic action can counteract oppression, even in contexts where formal justice is absent or inadequate. These lessons resonate across time, informing contemporary efforts to protect vulnerable individuals and promote social justice. One of the most enduring lessons of Branford Estate is the necessity of moral vigilance. Societies that fail to monitor and intervene in abusive situations risk enabling extreme exploitation. Branford Estate demonstrates that perpetrators are often embedded within social structures, cloaked in respectability, and empowered by societal inertia. Recognizing these realities is essential for both historical understanding and contemporary prevention of abuse. The legacy of Branford Estate also highlights the importance of narrative preservation. Henrietta's meticulous records ensured that the truth would not be lost to sanitized accounts or social convenience. Through her documentation, future generations can study the mechanisms of abuse, the moral complexities of resistance, and the enduring impact of systemic oppression. These narratives underscore the importance of bearing witness and preserving historical memory as tools for social and ethical accountability. The story of Branford Estate, though rooted in the 19th century, continues to reverberate in contemporary discussions of abuse, oppression, and ethical responsibility. It compels reflection on the consequences of unchecked power, the moral imperative to act against injustice, and the resilience of the human spirit in the face of extreme adversity. Survivors' experiences, acts of resistance, and the eventual downfall of Silas Branford offer enduring lessons for understanding human nature, societal complicity, and the possibilities for ethical action. Even as the Mississippi Delta now bears only the quiet rustle of crops where Branford Estate once stood, the moral and historical echoes remain. The story challenges us to recognize the signs of systemic abuse, honor the resilience of survivors, and uphold ethical vigilance in protecting the vulnerable. It reminds us that history is both a record of human depravity and a testament to courage, resistance, and the pursuit of justice. Branford Estate stands as a cautionary tale, a moral touchstone, and a repository of lessons for understanding the complexities of human behavior, societal structures, and ethical responsibility. Its story underscores the capacity for both evil and courage, illustrating that while oppression can devastate lives, resilience, solidarity, and moral courage can ultimately prevail. As we reflect on the dark history of Branford Estate, it becomes clear that the responsibility to recognize, confront, and prevent abuse is timeless. The actions of Henrietta, Tobias, and others exemplify the profound impact of moral courage, strategic thinking, and ethical action in confronting injustice. Their legacy continues to inspire and instruct, reminding us that vigilance, empathy, and the willingness to act against wrongdoing are essential for protecting the vulnerable and promoting justice across generations. In the aftermath of Branford Estate, the passage of time brought both silence and reflection. The land that had once been the epicenter of unimaginable cruelty and human suffering gradually returned to quiet agricultural use. But the shadows of its past lingered. The stories of those who survived, daughters, slaves, and allies alike, became a hidden archive of human resilience, moral courage, and the long-reaching consequences of abuse. For Joanna, the years following Silas Branford's death were a mixture of grief, relief, and enduring guilt. Though she had orchestrated the only effective resistance to her husband's cruelty, she was haunted by the memories of Frida's death and the suffering her daughters endured under Branford's control. Her role as protector and avenger came at a high personal cost. Joanna spent the remainder of her life devoted to the care of her surviving children, determined to provide them with stability, education, and opportunities that had been denied under the oppressive rule of their father. Yet no amount of love or attention could fully erase the psychological scars of forced breeding, abuse, and trauma that her daughters carried. Arlene's recovery was slow and fragile. The physical toll of repeated pregnancies and the emotional torment of losing her children left her with a deep distrust of authority and profound difficulties in forming bonds. The child she was allowed to keep became a lifeline, a reminder of hope, and the possibility of joy in a life otherwise dominated by suffering. Her story exemplifies the enduring impact of trauma on survivors and the complexity of rebuilding a life after systematic abuse. Caroline, whose health and emotional stability were irreparably damaged by the repeated pregnancies and forced complicity in the estate's operations, developed a lifelong nervous condition. She was often incapacitated by episodes of panic, nightmares, and silent withdrawal. Her suffering illustrates how trauma can extend far beyond the immediate act of abuse, shaping the rest of a survivor's life in profound ways. In many ways, Caroline's life became a living testament to the horrors of Branford Estate, a stark reminder that human cruelty, once enacted, leaves consequences that persist across time. Tobias, who had played a key role in resisting Silas Branford, carried the memory of forced complicity alongside the memory of courage and liberation. After moving north, he established a modest but meaningful life, dedicating himself to supporting others who had endured oppression. He became a quiet but powerful figure in his community, embodying the principles of solidarity, vigilance, and ethical action. Tobias's story highlights how even in the aftermath of extreme injustice, individuals can reclaim agency and contribute to healing and justice within their communities. Laia, though physically free, remained psychologically scarred by her experiences. The years she spent participating in Branford's scheme left permanent impressions on her sense of self, trust, and ability to form relationships. Yet, by rebuilding her life in New Orleans and establishing independence, she demonstrated resilience and the capacity to reclaim control over her identity. Laia's life reflects the duality of human endurance, the capacity to survive, and the cost that survival exacts on the psyche. The broader community, too, grappled with the legacy of Branford Estate, the moral and legal failures that allowed Silas Branford to operate with impunity revealed the limitations of social oversight and the dangers inherent in patriarchal authority, unchecked by accountability. Figures such as Dr. McCormick and Sheriff Mullins, who had chosen complicity or negligence over justice, became emblematic of a societal system that prioritized convenience, reputation, and social norms over the protection of vulnerable individuals. Their failures serve as stark warnings about the consequences of inaction in the face of systemic abuse. Branford Estate's story underscores the intersection of power, wealth, and morality. Silas Branford had transformed his household into a meticulously managed operation, treating human beings, his own daughters and enslaved people alike, as commodities. His cold, calculated approach to exploitation illustrates how societal and economic incentives can corrupt the human conscience. Yet, the actions of Joanna, Tobias, and the other resistant slaves demonstrate that even in extreme circumstances, ethical action remains possible. Their courage highlights the potential for individuals to confront and disrupt systems of abuse, even when the risks are immense. The psychological consequences of Branford Estate extended beyond those directly subjected to abuse. Descendants, neighbors, and community members carried the unspoken weight of knowing, or suspecting, what had occurred. The story became embedded in local memory, a dark legend that served both as cautionary tale and moral lesson. Communities learned, often silently, about the dangers of unchecked authority and the importance of moral vigilance. Branford Estate became more than a historical site. It became a cultural touchstone for examining justice, complicity, and ethical responsibility. Historically, Branford Estate challenges narratives that depict abuse and oppression solely as matters of race or class. While the plantation operated within the broader context of antebellum slavery, The systematic exploitation of Silas Branford's own daughters reveals how power can distort familial, gendered, and economic relationships in ways that extend beyond conventional racial hierarchies. This story forces historians, ethicists, and social commentators to consider the full scope of human cruelty, the mechanisms by which it is rationalized, and the strategies required to resist it. From a legal and ethical perspective, Branford Estate exposes the profound limitations of the systems intended to protect the vulnerable. The failure of law enforcement, the corruption of medical authority, and the societal acceptance of patriarchal control allowed atrocities to proceed with near impunity. Yet, it also illustrates that justice is not always confined to formal institutions. In extreme circumstances, moral action, coordinated, deliberate, and sometimes extralegal, can serve as a form of justice when conventional systems fail. Joanna's orchestration of Silas Branford's demise is a morally complex act, reflecting both the necessity of intervention and the tragic consequences of delay. The legacy of Branford Estate also includes lessons for contemporary society. Understanding how power, greed, and social norms can facilitate abuse remains critical in contexts ranging from domestic violence to human trafficking. The story emphasizes the importance of vigilance, the courage to challenge authority, and the ethical imperative to intervene on behalf of those who cannot protect themselves. It serves as a call to action, reminding modern audiences that systemic abuse thrives in silence, and that moral courage can be the difference between survival and continued victimization. In memory, Branford Estate stands as both a warning and a testament. The estate's physical erasure does not diminish its historical and ethical significance. The stories preserved by survivors like Henrietta, the accounts of those who resisted like Tobias, and the lived experiences of Arlene, Caroline, and Lyre ensure that the estate's history continues to inform contemporary understanding of abuse, resilience, and justice. These narratives demand recognition, analysis, and reflection. The symbolic importance of Branford Estate lies in its duality. It embodies both the capacity for human depravity and the potential for ethical action in the face of overwhelming oppression. Silas Branford represents the dangers of moral corruption unchecked by societal constraints, while the actions of Joanna, Tobias, and the surviving women illustrate the resilience of conscience, the power of solidarity, and the possibility of reclaiming agency even under extreme duress. The estate becomes a moral lens through which the complexities of human behavior, societal failure, and ethical courage can be examined. As generations passed, the physical landscape around Branford Estate changed, but the moral landscape remained. Scholars, educators, and community leaders reference the story as a paradigm for understanding the intersections of abuse, power, and societal complicity. Local lore continued to recount the tale of Branford's cruelty and the eventual act of resistance, emphasizing the lessons learned about vigilance, justice, and the human capacity for both evil and courage. The story of Branford Estate concludes not with redemption of the perpetrator, but with the endurance and moral courage of those who survived and resisted. It is a narrative that compels reflection on personal responsibility, societal oversight, and the ethical imperatives that arise in the face of extreme injustice. Though the physical structures have vanished, the psychological and ethical imprints remain, offering a lasting testament to both the fragility and resilience of the human spirit. Ultimately, Branford Estate challenges us to confront uncomfortable truths. Monsters are often not strangers in the dark, but those entrusted with care and authority. At the same time, the story affirms that even in circumstances of profound despair, resistance, courage, and ethical action are possible. The estate's history is a reminder that justice is not always linear or immediate, that survival often requires difficult choices, and that moral vigilance is essential to protecting the vulnerable. Through reflection, preservation, and education, the lessons of Branford Estate endure. They remind us that history is both a record of cruelty and a guide for ethical action, that the consequences of inaction are profound, and that human courage, when mobilized, can overcome even the darkest circumstances. While the Mississippi Delta may now be quiet, the memory of Branford Estate echoes still, not as a ghost story, but as a moral imperative to remember, to learn, and to act.